Guy Malone. Welcome to Roswell, New Mexico. You're here during the UFO Festival. We do it every July 4th weekend, commemorating the crash of something that legitimately, honest to God, crashed near, a couple hours away from Roswell, New Mexico. It was brought here to Roswell, and the reason it's called the Roswell UFO crash has to do with it was taken to an Army air base. The craft was recovered here in Roswell, the 509. So this is kind of a repeat of something Joe and I have been doing for 10 years. You may know now this talk goes against the famous flying saucer captured by the Roswell Army Airfield of July 1947. I'm going to say it was not the result of an alien craft from outer space crashing in the Roswell region or Corona, New Mexico, really. Here's the test. All right. So kind of like the first cover story, except I'm not arguing for the weather balloon, like General Ramey famously claimed in 47. So getting started, just a show of hands. How many people here already know about a former top secret program name is Operation Paperclip? All right, it's more than the majority. I like that. You may not know, it's been covered since about 2006, even by the X-Files. But back in 2002, when I first came across this, it was a long uphill road to talk about Operation Paperclip in front of a crowd. I'll whiz through the basics of it, but a lot faster than I used to have to in 2002, because you do know about it now. And I don't believe that the Roswell incident was simply a weather balloon, as the Army Air Force stated, and the Roswell Daily Record reported that next day after General Ramey emptied the famous Roswell saucer. The article reads, General Ramey says disc is a weather balloon. An examination by the Army revealed last night that the mysterious objects found in a lonely New Mexico ranch was a harmless high-altitude weather balloon. If you know, that was a deep cut. But that was the official story reported to the public, and it stood for nearly 50 years. As you probably know already, the people who are even slightly in the know on this were ordered not to speak of it, including reports of death threats if they did so. A local radio station was actually threatened by a phone call from Washington. They would lose their FCC license if they aired the interview, which they recorded with Mac Brazel, a rancher, right afterwards. He originally found and called in the 1947 wreckage. Nobody knows exactly what date. Reports vary. It could have laid around for a week, honestly. But we celebrate it in Roswell as July 2's, not official, but it'll do. July 4th weekend, great excuse for a party. Let's have a festival. But he called it in. He said in the Roswell Daily Record article that he'd previously found two other weather balloons observations that did belong to the Army, called them in. What he found in this way did not in any way resemble them. So nobody really believed the weather balloon story, but they were afraid to question it too. Boom. Okay. This is case closed. Just in time for Roswell's very famous 1997 50th anniversary of the Roswell incident, U.S. Air Force came out with what is known as Project Mogul Balloon explanation for their 97 case closed book. They admitted they were in fact lying in 1947 about the harmless high-altitude weather balloon, but that they were lying then to cover up a different top-secret type of weather balloon. Both the 1947 fast-forwarding and the 1997 official explanations offered by our government they're full of holes enough to be classified as just ridiculous fabrications at this point. So right now you've got the alien hypothesis, the original weather balloon story, and then the revised top-secret mogul balloon story. However, there's now a fourth hypothesis on the table. It's gained a lot of ground among many researchers anyway, but not so much in Hollywood, not the mass media, and definitely not the general public, or here in Roswell either, where the alien story makes us lots of money these days. If you haven't noticed, yeah, you have. It's shit tons, honestly. Therefore, it shall not be questioned, okay? Normally, anyway, but I first presented the same talk publicly at the 2010 Roswell UFO Festival, at the city's official conference for that matter. I didn't get lynched or booed off stage. Hoping that pattern still holds today, but this is the front page that I shared. Different PowerPoint, sorry. There is a front page, it may have been on here. Joe and I shared with Nick Redfern during the 2017 UFO Festival. It'll come up later. The Daily Record gave our Alien Skeptic presentation some very nice remarks and great coverage, and that's a truly, I gotta find this. a very ingenious headline that Lisa Dunlap came up with, I think, separating the extra from the terrestrial. My favorite. Again, it's just responsible journalism that the RDR, the record, gives equal time to differing views, including on the front page necessarily, not just on the op-ed. Great paper. They are holding the line on journalistic integrity, family owned since the 18, I love it. But I've also presented this in Nashville, Tennessee, and in Orlando, and this is Philadelphia MUFON. We know MUFON has some true believers. You know, just a reminder, I didn't get lynched there either. On their YouTube, thousands of views. The most derogatory comments that MUFON members had to say about this presentation was my glasses were annoying them the whole time while they were watching online. But all the images talk with Roswell UFO Crash.com since 2002. I stumbled on the research of thanks to Dr. Michael Heiser, PhD theologian who has also spoken in Roswell many times, now also deceased, I'm sorry to say. I dedicate this presentation to him at the end of it if the PowerPoint holds. But well done, sir. Thank you, Michael. Today I'm mainly sharing with you the list of historically accurate and now known facts about what our government and our military in highly compartmentalized ways, like the Manhattan Project, in fact were working on in 1947 that most people today have actually never heard about. The facts I think most people can agree on. That number one, in July 47, an unusual craft crashed in the desert of New Mexico. The Roswell Army base was involved in recovering the craft and possibly bodies. Reports vary even on that, 0 to 5. On July 8th, the Roswell newspaper published a front page article, Roswell Army Airfield captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. 4, following orders, the military recanted the flying disc press release hours later, claiming via the next day's paper that it was just a weather balloon. And the undeniable fact, still today, the U.S. government has been lying to us about it ever since. When the Air Force changed their official story in 1997's Roswell case closed, they also added this little crazy bit about literal crash test dummies being the explanation for the bodies. The problem was, researchers immediately pointed out, and I think also passed, Stanton Friedman gets the credit for documenting first, that these dummies had not even been invented in 47. They were not used by the Air Force for anything documented until 1953. So that's easy fact to verify. And Dr. Heiser commented first that not only was the Air Force lying again in 1997's report, they wanted people to be able to easily figure out that they were lying again. What I'm positing is that they unofficially, even from the first press release from 47, they want people to think this incident was extraterrestrial, to cover up some very, very ugly truths. Starting with Operation Paperclip, which we mentioned. It's an official U.S. government photograph from 1946. I grabbed it in 2002 from NASA.gov. These are the first 104 Nazi German scientists who were moved here to the United States immediately following World War II. Very well known now. It wasn't known at all in the 40s because it was illegal that they were here. I'll get back to that quick soon, but here's the current Wikipedia entry. Yeah. Okay, they were originally moved to Fort Bliss, Texas, where that earlier picture was taken, and some to the White Sands Proving Grounds, New Mexico, and many of them were previously working on some very interesting advanced flying prototypes for Adolf Hitler in the closing years, months even, of World War II. One of those pictured is Wernher von Braun, who went on to NASA and Disney fame eventually. Yeah, you guys know that. Historians tell us that before this, von Braun and these others came to America, had Hitler gotten his working flying machines that were already inventing prototypes of into mass production before the Allies invaded Germany, that the Allied forces would have lost World War II. Here's the earliest and the perhaps definitive books on the subject. Tom Bauer, 1987, long after the most famous books on the Roswell crash were published. We're going to go over those in a minute. I can't read this live, I have to move on. They grabbed weapons, instruments, tools, files, and above all, scientists. There's also Linda Hunt's 1991 secret agenda. The government fought her so hard on the documents she was digging up through the Freedom of Information Act, they presented her a bill for $239 in 1991 money in what they called search fees that her requests put them through. So you think they were trying to scare her off a bit? Maybe I do. So these scientists were secretly brought to the United States under a media blackout program that paper-clipped fake bios of their Nazi crime dossiers because President Truman was adamantly against putting certified Nazi criminals on the American payroll. The restriction would have rendered ineligible most of the scientists, among them Wernher von Braun and Arthur Rudolph, who were earlier classified as a, quote, menace to the security of the Allied forces. Truman expressly ordered that no real practicing Nazis be brought into the U.S. We can only speculate, by the way, but von Braun's real dossier is still unavailable to the public. Second aside, he's also claimed that the U.S. government was going to fake an alien. Wernher von Braun said that the U.S. government was going to fake an alien invasion one day, according to his secretary, Carol, who repeats it all the time. Sometime after, get this, the Russian scare and the Middle Eastern crazies, maybe an asteroid, and then a fake alien invasion. Wernher von Braun said that, according to his secretary, who speaks for him still today. We know now that the war on drugs and the war on terror were screens for black ops budgets with no congressional accountability, and they're only getting better at this trick, is what I'll say. Getting to the relevance of 1947, though, in Roswell, again, Dr. Heiser gets the credit in his book, The Facade, for pointing me in this direction of research. Yeah. First published in the year 2000. Now, that's at least how long ago that I know of this type of information has been out there and available for UFO researchers and you to draw upon and to prove or to disprove. Thus began Project Paperclip. Its aim was simple: to exploit German scientists for American research and to deny these intellectual resources to the Soviet Union. All of these men were cleared for work in the U.S., their alleged crimes covered up and their backgrounds bleached by a military which saw winning the Cold War, not upholding justice, as its first priority. This is the same BBC article includes a picture of what we now nonchalantly know of as the B-2 bomber, the stealth bomber, formerly one of our most highly classified crafts. But this article actually refers back to a World War II German craft. The 1944 Horten Ho 229 is being, underlined in red there, the first stealth aircraft. Horten Ho 229, Germany, 1944, referred to in a 1970 book, Warplanes of the Third Reich. Now, part of the popular mythology, I will dare say, associated with the Roswell crash is the idea that our stealth aircraft, namely this B-2 bomber, was back engineered from the Roswell 47 crashed ship. It's now known that that is not accurate. Don't believe me? It's still true. BBC actually refers to our B-2 stealth bomber as a modern clone of the Horten, and the caption under the photo reads, "The stealth bomber, based on a 1944 German design." Yeah. The article speculates that the U.S. may have developed even more advanced Nazi technology, including anti-gravity devices, potential sources of free energy. Apologies, Stephen Greer, if you're listening. This article from November 2005 suggests that what modern UFO advocates refer to as a truth embargo, to use Steve Bassett's term, or even Rich Dolan's national security state, did not begin in 1947. This cover-up began right here. The real cover-up of Roswell began in 1945 is what I'm trying to say. It's counterintuitive, but the front page of the New York Times on November 17th, 45, bore a curiously vague headline: 88 German scientists reach here, reportedly with top war secrets. The scientists had arrived on a converted ocean liner the day before. Unusual precautions were taken to keep the arrival secret, the Times reported. Reporters were warned away. So in short, the arrival of the Nazi scientists to teach the U.S. how to build advanced aircraft was covered up. Effective 1945. Skipping some but sharing the darker portions of the article, men who just 7 months earlier had been at war with the United States were being ushered onto our shores by the government. The purpose: to jumpstart American high-tech industry. The program's architects are sometimes willing to build on the results of often deadly Nazi research on captive human subjects. These men and women were in essence spoils of war. Also, Great Britain, France, Argentina, and Yugoslavia. Rivalries grew fierce in the following months as countries hid information from one another, scrambled to snag the best equipment and talent for themselves. By next year, she writes, 150 scientists were working in our country at locations like Wright Field in Ohio. Wright Field in Ohio. Half this room knows why that's significant, don't you? Yeah, Wright Field is where the wreckage from the Roswell 1947 was eventually taken, to where these guys were housed. A very significant detail. The author, Christine Gibson, continues to tell that slave laborers were experimented on specifically to determine what pilots could withstand. Yes, I'm on the right PowerPoint. Hallelujah. It wasn't illegal either then. But Paperclip left behind another darker legacy. The program's architects, post-1945, were willing sometimes to build on the results of often deadly Nazi research on captive human subjects. These experiments and Paperclip itself were among the first manifestation of what became a guiding principle of the Cold War, that the ends sometimes justified the means. She lays out beautifully the rationale for Operation Paperclip and the fact that now 2 separate news articles came out in November 2005 almost to me indicates that whoever controls the press on these matters was kind of okay with the American people and the British people finding out about the Nazis working on U.S. soil, but not until 60 years after the fact. And that after 2 important books were published against their will, proving this, but all we can maybe really understand why under no circumstances could that information be let out in 1947. What if you had just lost 2 sons fighting the Nazis? How would you react in 1947 to find out they're living in the United States and they're eating very well on your tax dollars? These Paperclip scientists, they were not only brilliant when it comes to technology, but they were very adept and willing to perform experiments on human test subjects, specifically as said to determine what pilots could withstand. So if you're already having some trouble with this, I'm going to warn you, this lecture is going to take some really dark turns eventually. But back to the Horton, here's a few more of the pictures, including one for recreation. All right, I'll just zoom these. National Geographic, many sources, they could have changed the course of the war. Wikipedia states these jets were way faster than anything the U.S. had. Something about Indiana Jones from Hasbro's up in here. One site's Northrop. We knew Germany had these vehicles in prototype production prior to the end of World War II, but does that necessarily mean the American military ever got them also? What's all this got to do with Roswell? Okay, here's some documentation from before the 2005 articles that I read from earlier. A January 46 document that I pulled from Dr. Heiser's website. This is National Geographic. I was supposed to flip through these. Horton, Hasbro, Northrop, blah, 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 there. Documentation that proves the U.S. Air Corps had a working knowledge of the German flying wings designed by the Horton brothers and was authorized to begin work on them here in the U.S. at Wright Field in 1946. Here's a picture. Picture of one being unloaded from a train in August in 1945 in the USA. The entry for the Horton ends by saying Northrop was chosen because Jack Northrop had been building flying wings since 1939. So why is this important for our purposes today? There's 2 reasons. One, if you did not work for Northrop Corporation in the United States military compartment that brought this aircraft over here from Germany in August 45, or if you weren't privy to Operation Paperclip in the mid-1940s, if you weren't, that was the clandestine operation being carried out specifically against the president's orders. So this is a very small number of people that knew what was going on. The odds are you didn't know that a craft of this type existed. But the number 2 reason this is incredibly important, who knows who this is? Ken Arnold, the pilot who in June 1947 said that he witnessed an amazingly fast airship over Mount Rainier in Washington State. It's important to note he described that their flight characteristics as skipping like a saucer, and as a result, June 47, the press first coined the phrase flying saucer based on what pilot Kenneth Arnold's testimony. which is actually wrong. It's not. He didn't say flying saucer. Bad journalist. Ken Arnold said it skipped like a saucer, not that it looked like a saucer. What he drew was obviously not saucer shaped. The flying saucer is just the term the press coined in June 1947. The Roswell Daily Record reported a flying saucer captured on the ranch in July 1947. So the term flying saucer was not based on physical or eyewitness description of the craft. It was just the phrase already popularized by the press. Important note. So please keep your eye on the screen real quick for me here, if I do this right. I'm going to skip one accidentally. That one. Just more quotes from Kenneth Arnold. But now that we know that these guys, the Operation Paperclip Nazi scientists from Germany, were working on reproducing these type of craft, that's another Wikipedia image of the Horton for American use, and that the paperclip scientists were spread across these locations: Fort Bliss, Texas; Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio; and then of all places, White Sands Proving Grounds, New Mexico. Now, would anyone argue that what Kenneth Arnold described in 1947 was really from outer space? That's Germany 1944, and we moved the guys that built that over here in 1945. So those of you that are really researched on the Roswell incidents know there's a bit of controversy around the actual shape of the craft recovered in 47, not being whether it was round or saucer. You may have pictured in your head due to cartoon artwork or Hollywood renditions, but the main books on the Roswell incident that first got everybody's attention, Exhibit A, Crash at Corona, not at Roswell, by the way, Crash at Corona by Don Berliner and Stanton Friedman, and The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell, Kevin Randall, Don Schmidt, shook hands. We talked at the Calaveras Salad Bar the other night. It was good times. He's looking good. Which has been, book's been rewritten a bit, updated with startling new information, or some retractions from the first version that the authors even no longer affirm. But the original Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt books shown here, they are also the basis for the very famous 1944 movie, Roswell, the UFO Cover-Up, and are also credited as the writers of that movie. So what they said then is the basis for much of what the world now believes. That goes without saying, but it must be said because it started with these guys. I'll argue. I also have in my possession, you should have seen them when you were walking in, some original artwork by a gentleman named Frank Hoffman, who served in the Roswell Army Air Base's 509th Bomb Squad in 1947. He claimed to have been involved in the cleanup of the wreckage and the bodies. The images he drew are his alleged first-hand eyewitness testimony of what he cleaned up, or at least of what he saw. And you can see that the version of the craft he drew is not round, but it's more manta, or manta-shaped than it is circular. Go back. Somewhere in there. The authors themselves no longer, the other witnesses' testimony in quotes at the bottom, the craft that crashed at Roswell was long and narrow. It was not a flying saucer. If you use words like canon to go with the Roswell crash, that's canon. You'd have to review the authors' newest materials and their blogs to find out if anything's changed or what has in their ongoing research. We're all still discovering. But of course, the only tiniest fraction of the people who read these original books are ever going to get the updates, or they were influenced by the movie. They don't have any basis for knowing. Some authors may feel differently, but back to Kaufman's drawings of the original craft. Okay, whatever he saw and published in his book, Roswell 1947, I was there, Robert Shirky and Frank Kaufman worked together, and in 1947, Kaufman being an artist, he went to art school, Shirky being the writer. So there's some inconsistency among the various witnesses still, depending on how credible they are, who believes who, whether Corona crash was round or manta. But back on track, we do know for sure the U.S. had scientists working here, working from the German designs. And we do have real pictures of the Horton. Here's another German prototype, the Lippisch. We only have sketches and models. The war ended. Here's a model by fantasticplanet.com of what it would have looked like had the Germans gotten one operational. It's rumored they did get it operational, but yada yada, if it built, it would have looked like this. So the same German aircraft scientists who were designing, building, and testing both this Horton model and the Fantastic Planet one, beginning in 1945, they were brought here to the U.S. to top secretly design advanced aircraft for the Americanos. So what do you think? Just like the Ken Arnold flying saucer, are we looking at an alien craft on the right, or just possibly a U.S. model based on German designs? Because it's either really amazing just how close those Germans got in World War II to designing ships that looked amazingly like extraterrestrial spacecraft that didn't get here until 1947, allegedly. Or perhaps there's another explanation, okay? Maybe the German scientists who designed the Hortons and the Lippisch in, say, 1944, given 2 years in the U.S. secret labs with a blank check from Uncle Sam, maybe they developed a spiffier model by July 1947. And I'm not claiming I can document 100% exactly what happened. I can say there's more going on technologically than the American public knew about, and more than 99% of the military even knew about. Maybe an alien spacecraft crashed here and the government covered it up, or maybe a man-made ship designed by Nazis in a secret illegal U.S. bases crashed here and the government covered it up. Many of you are going to bounce right back to the question, well, what about the bodies and the exotic metal found at the crash site? Because I did. If you're in this room, I'm pretty sure you know so far what I've shared actually doesn't solve this completely, not by a long shot. So just for my own sake, I had to answer my own questions about the metal and the bodies before even going public with any of this. So keep in mind, I've introduced the topic of human experimentation. This gets a little darker. But if you want to argue that the recovered crash was round, there's a whole stream of research on this. I'm going to just jump through these. Man-made, I don't own that URL anymore. Hitler's flying saucers, those are photos, by the way. The author of this appears on the History Channel sometimes. Joseph Farrell, he's a deep thinker, coast to coast. He thinks the Roswell crash came from South American scientists. Maybe they were messing with us. But in addition to the Russia and U.S., today I've mostly focused on the Horton model and its resemblance to the Kenneth Arnold sightings that made flying saucers a buzzword in the U.S. media 1 month before July 47. But a lot of the furor, the hoopla, the surrounding, the immediate response to the Roswell Daily Record's first article was precisely because everybody in America was already primed. They knew that advanced airships were being seen across the U.S. and reported on nationally. So the scoop of the century truly came when Roswell Daily Record headline reads, Roswell Army Airfield captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. Now there's one on the ground being examined by our own incredibly heroic and immensely trustworthy government. So perhaps Americans can now finally know the truth and find out what these things were. The promise was just packed with excitement, but we all know that's not what happened. Because were they hiding aliens from us? Possible aliens is not the only thing worth covering up. I think I've demonstrated we were already covering up that scientists were here. We're trying to beat the Russians to developing this technology, so we had other secrets to keep. I don't think 1940s Americana would have really wanted to know that we had over 100 Nazi scientists here on the secret military bases working for us. And the president and top military brass sure as heck didn't want to own up to Operation Paperclip either, especially given that the president's explicit orders were disobeyed and circumvented by the organization that was about to become known as the CIA. Not much has changed. I'm suggesting that there was a moral outrage of the fact any of this getting out in the 1940s would have been at least as bad and divisive for our country as the Vietnam War was decades later. It's of course highly debatable whether we should have even brought these guys into the country, but after World War II we had the Cold War starting up, and all the evidence suggests the Soviet Union and at least half a dozen other countries were recruiting these scientists and taking them and their technology into their borders. Where would we be today if we had not done the same? It's a very tough call no matter how you look at it. So in closing, the true fact, not closing out my introduction, the true facts are in 40 to 45, Nazi scientists were aggressively developing amazing flying machines. You The U.S. moved them all to Texas and White Sands Proving Ground. In 1947, an unidentified flying object crashes in the New Mexico desert, and the military enforces the greatest cover-up of any event ever discovered by the general public. Switching gears a hair, the obvious question, what about the bodies? This is going to offend some of you. I'm sorry. That's not my intent. Getting to the truth of all this was, and I just let the research take me where it did. I didn't like where it went. I've briefly introduced the ugly fact that human experimentation was part of what the Nazis were guilty of before they came here. There's an article from the George Washington University's National Securities Archive, linked from the archive here. The documents that human experimentation continued afterwards on U.S. soil. It's just a plain text document, matter-of-factly says that these scientists were here at the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine in the United States after they were here. And it reads in part, the Air Force's School of Aviation Medicine, Brooks Air Force Base in Texas, conducted dozens of human radiation experiments during the Cold War. That's post-World War II. Among them, flash blindness studies in connection with atomic weapons tests, gathered data gathering for total body irradiation studies conducted in Houston, and that the experiments for such the Nazi investigators were tried included many related to aviation research. These were many high-altitude exposure studies, oxygen deprivation experiments, and cold studies related to air-sea rescue operations. This information about aircrew hazards was important to both sides. A number of military research sites recruited paperclip scientists with backgrounds in aeromedicine, radiobiology. Portfolio of experiments at U.S. Air Force School of Aviation Medicine included total body irradiation, space medicine, flash blindness studies. In March '51, this is human experimentation as a matter of routine 4 years after the Roswell incident, written in 1951 to, quote, seek more first-class scientists, highly qualified technologists from Germany. Now, this is sad. It is, in some effect, damning. It's a sad but true part of our American history that our government has many times experimented on humans without their knowledge or consent. There's so many lists of these acts online, just rinse.com that I found in 2010, putting this together, easily verifiable. I'm not going to read them. American soldiers, civilian hospital patients to radiation, gas masks, LSD, addressing Congress, finally, astronaut John Glenn, 2 pages, astronaut John Glenn. When I looked into it, there's no law on the books requiring that informed consent be obtained. I believe there's a need for such a law.
Wow.
We still don't have such a law on our books requiring that informed consent be obtained prior to conducting research on human subjects. Finally, Mr. President, my legislation with 1997, I might have missed one. Spoiler. 1997, John Glenn is recommending legislation that you and I have to be informed anytime the government or even a corporation wants to experiment on us. It's a cold, hard fact. Our U.S. government, and frankly anybody, had carte blanche to experiment on humans without their knowledge or consent. And that definitely includes the early days of the Cold War era before 1945 and before July of 1947. So relating to Roswell, once you're not afraid to go where I don't think many Americans living in 1947 would have even dreamed was possible, there's definitely a few possible explanations for the reports that have arisen. Many of y'all might have already known of Nick Redfern's 2005 book, Body Snatchers in the Desert. I hardly even knew him when I was writing this theory. I just seen him speak once or twice, Aztec. But much was following, he was following leads himself about a book on the man-made explanation for the Roswell incident. Didn't know that. On my site, I put forth this total shot in the dark hypothesis about the bodies. I was aware that human experimentation occurred, and also that institutionalized people who wouldn't be as readily missed were sometimes the targets. So I went on Google, and based on what the prominent Roswell witnesses claimed, I just simply typed in symptoms: large bald head, big eyes. For the first time, I heard about progeria. As I wrote on that website over 20 years ago, I hoped I'd never been more wrong about anything in my life, but children with progeria usually have dwarf, bald head, a pinched nose, a large head with small face, prominent eyes, rapid aging of children, disproportionately small bodies given the size of their heads. The children are thin with baldness. Among their symptoms, diminished growth. The lifespan is early teens. Nick Redfern wrote to me. All this math is adding up about this. Progeria was just the original line of thinking. Redfern and Heiser postulated that people in the crash ship could have either been other human unfortunates like POWs, radiation victims. And when Nick reviewed my site, I posted his reply because I felt honored to have a positive review from someone of his stature. He said, I would agree with you possibly that the bodies were human. It's very real. The only problem I have with progeria is that it's extremely rare, with the Nazis been able to acquire 5 people of similar appearance in 1947. But he looked into it a bit more, and it turns out the last chapter of his now infamous book is titled Progeria. I have to skip through Dr. Heiser's summary of Nick's book. That's what it was. He's the one that got me, Dr. Heiser, on the paperclip trail. I think I got him started on the Progeria trail, actually. It was an inspiration. I typed that into Google. I don't know where I got that. But the view taken in the facade is that the Roswell crash of July 2, 1947 was in fact a paperclip accident. That's an actual government archive picture he posts, but from a later date, not 1947. The facade further argues that the bodies recovered, that the crash victims were human unfortunates, mongoloids, Asians, progeria victims, etc., deemed worthy of the type of human experimentation required for testing of high altitude craft. Okay. Mike from his page was kind of my source for the 46 report cover I showed you earlier. Related addendum, email to Nick. This you can look at later online if you watch this, pause it. Reading one paragraph from Nick Redfern's Progeria chapter, however. One critical piece of evidence officially links such conditions as progeria and dwarfism with the activities of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and elsewhere in the summer of 1947. More specifically, the report focused on the results of a whole range of radiation-related experiments undertaken in mid-1947, no fewer than 54 test subjects, of whom 15 were between 1 and 4 years of age. 7 were controls, 2 were classic cretins. 1 showed some features of hypothyroidism which were not modified by the treatment. 2 were dwarfs. 1, the diagnosis was gargoylism. 1 was suspected of progeria, a disorder associated with some of the features of hypothyroidism. The last exhibited features of moderate sexual precocity. 27 were more than 4, but less than 15 years of age. 27 kids our government was experimenting on in 1947 to see what pilots could withstand. Of these, 2 had unmistakable hypothyroidism, Graves' disease, and 4 were dwarves, unquote. November 3, 1947 issue of Biology Division Bulletin of the Clinton National Laboratory, pages 202-203. I'm not asking you if you believe Nick's hypothesis about some of those kids playing in the Roswell incident, my original progeria, or even Mike's earlier picture suggests, if you believe his hypothesis. But I am asking, do you now believe that there could be a or any terrestrial earthly explanation for the bodies that were reportedly found in 1947? Maybe, yeah, because I'm really about to stir the pot locally, that is. Every time I do this, it goes online. But saying that the only images you've ever been exposed to of these Roswell bodies were based on something that was drawn third hand in 1991, 44 years after this alleged meeting occurred between Glenn Dennis and the mystery woman. At the time of writing the above affidavit, artist Walter Henn drew the following sketches under the direction of Glenn Dennis. The sketches are to depict the drawing allegedly made for Dennis by the nurse. The 1989 drawing accompanies Glenn Dennis's 91 affidavit of his participation in the Roswell incident. His story is also a huge part of why we're all here today, because Glenn Dennis is one of the original founders of the Roswell UFO Museum. He's the mortician who was called, and I believe this part, he was called by the Army Air Base to provide for them 4 child-sized caskets after they arrived back in town with this wreckage from the incident. But as it relates to the drawing from decades later, he added some details. His legit child-sized coffins testimony, which many have publicly disputed. He says he later had a meeting with the nurse from the Army base who was very troubled about what she'd seen and drew him a picture of the bodies she'd supposedly seen. So, recap. At age 65, Mr. Dennis is remembering what he claims an unidentified nurse at the Army Air Base drew for him. A nurse, no researcher has ever been able to verify ever existed, and frankly, most say he just now made up. Google it yourself and see the verdict on what the credible published Roswell researchers all say these days, but decades after all these books were first released. And about the Roswell nurse Naomi Self, an artist, Walter Henn, drew these sketches for him based on what Glenn Dennis said he remembered in 1989 of this unidentified nurse's 1947 sketch, which he says he lost. Exhibit A, as you can see why I've never been invited to the UFO Museum to do this talk, but Wikipedia, not Guy Malone, says Dennis's accounts featured prominently in Crash at Corona. Serious doubts about his story were soon raised. For some, like Carl Flock and Kevin Randall, these inconsistencies were great enough to discount Dennis's credibility entirely. Researchers who investigated Dennis's claims found a number of inconsistencies. These sketches that Dennis supplied to Friedman in 1989 were discovered to have a questionable history. Dennis had not drawn them as he claimed. He asked another artist, Walter Henn, to do them. Henn said he'd been approached by Dennis, who needed to supply UFO research for some of the drawings he claimed the nurse had done. Henn claimed Dennis said we could make a lot of money out of this. Quoting myself, shit tons of money we made out of this. Drawn third hand 42 years later, that single debatable image is the major source of almost all Roswell bodies, stories, and movies and drawings that you've most likely ever seen. But is this testimony credible? For your consideration, the drawings of Frank Kaufman, whom I introduced earlier as part of the 509th Army Air Base. This is what the 509th, handled and cleaned up the Roswell crash debris and possibly bodies, although I admit there's no way of telling how much of his testimony can be believed either, unfortunately. But this is what Frank Kaufman drew to describe the bodies he claimed to have personally witnessed. I own this artwork. You saw it when it came outside. Joe or someone, please grab that. It's very valuable. This is not a third-hand drawing, but it's first-hand. Kaufman also attended art school before joining the military, by the way. So you think you learned to draw there? Oh. I'll say that to remind you, every drawing of the Roswell bodies and ship you've likely been ever exposed to, is based on testimony that the researchers who originally published the drawings and who wrote the books now dispute as inauthentic. America and the whole world is under a mistaken notion that I think I can fairly and accurately describe as a modern mythology. These images don't look particularly alien, but I also submit that no drawings of the alleged bodies are considered reliable by any majority of the published Roswell researchers. All we know is they're pretty universally said to have large heads, big eyes, and child-sized bodies. Something like this, I'm afraid. The resemblance is so eerie. On the right is actually a 1986 movie with a progeria kid actor cast as a spaceman. So knowing that high altitude and radiation tests were among the exact human experimentation tests being run all through the 1940s, and that disfigured and so-called undesirables were among the favorite victims of the experiments. And with what you know today, I'm simply posing the question to you, would you put it past them to have put someone like this into an experimental craft just to see what the effects on the human body would be of perhaps never before achieved altitudes and speeds or radiation in the upper atmosphere? Or would you put it past our government now or then to use someone like this to find out how much radiation a human body could safely absorb, assuming they're flying a craft with a brand new, untested nuclear-powered engine? I say flying, it got called out, probably remote controlled, by the way. I'm not suggesting the kids were flying. Somebody gave me some research one day, but you don't want to risk Chuck Yeager on your earliest prototype flights is the point. We all know you start with dogs and chimpanzees and then you work your way up. Cold but true. I'm sorry, this is supposed to be the UFO festival, and this line of thought isn't very festive, and I realize, but is aliens the only possible explanation even for any dead or dying bodies that might have been found at the 47 crash site? I'm sorry, and I'm sick to my stomach to report to you that the answer is no. There was a Cold War going on. Both sides felt that it had to be won at any cost, and I'm not asking you to buy any one particular line of reasoning, 100%, but now that you know what people in 47 and in 97, after the main books had been published, now that you know what absolutely nobody was allowed to know back then, you know that the crash ship itself doesn't require an alien spacecraft anymore. So, do the reports of odd bodies require an alien space explanation? Heck, if you'd never heard of progeria or hypothyroidism, you saw a human body that looked like this in a weird crash ship out in the desert, you'd think it was alien. Let's hope I can lighten things up a little bit before we close this out. The memory metal that the crashed Roswell ship was partly made of was designed as being very tough, but if crumpled or bent, would go back to its original shape. Nothing like that was known to exist at the time, right? Right? There's so much talk about all the marvels that were allegedly back-engineered from this Roswell crash, like the stealth bombers. We know that was not the case. This being Roswell, I imagine some of you are familiar with this book. The top secret file of Roswell information came into my possession when I took over the foreign technology desk at R&D. Today, items such as lasers, integrated circuitry, we owe that to the Roswell crash. It was alien technology, lasers, accelerated particle beam weapons, aircraft is equipped with stealth features. I am not saying that Colonel Philip Corso Jr. was lying, or Corso was, I believe, he believed what he was telling, and his book was true to the best of his knowledge, but whoever told him that our stealth technology was back engineered from an alien craft, or whoever told the person above him was lying. And that's a fact that you know now. A retired Army colonel who was put in charge of the Roswell wreckage did not know when he published his book in 1997, stealth technology was invented prior to Roswell by Germans, which makes it really easy to believe that whoever created these files and the filing cabinet that Colonel Corso was put in charge of was lying. But why would someone in the government do that to our military or to those under their command, we might even ask? Colonel Corso gives us the answer in his own book. Paragraph 3 of the introduction, telling us before his involvement with Roswell files, he knew a terrible secret that some of our government's most revered institutions had been penetrated by the KGB. Colonel Corso testified in 1962 himself. Now here's how intelligence and counterintelligence agencies sometimes work when they suspect that they have moles, and the CIA or the top military officials, they're trying to figure out who to go after. So you give one person some top secret intelligence or some data or experimental technology and tell them it's Russian origin and it got smuggled out by our own spies. You give someone else that same tech and tell them it's created from Tesla technology. You give someone else it's from an extraterrestrial craft, for instance, and then someone else, Westinghouse, invented it and we seized it under the Military Application Powers Law. None of these stories have to be true. But you create some documentation, you give it to 4 different people, then you wait and see which lie makes it back to the Soviets, and then back to you, and then you know who your mole is. So like I said, Corso passed. He was not lying in his testimony. He did not spill the beans, but he kept that secret until much later in life. But I think he was repeating a lie that he'd been told that he still believed. The true backstory of the B-2 bomber is all we need to know, though, to know that he was wrong about the Roswell wreckage leading to that. So, especially last year, recent headlines, this is an insert, the whistleblowing Congress, the whistleblower du jour, Bob Lazar, Richard Doty, Colonel Corso, Blink-182, Tom DeLonge, now this latest and greatest guy, David Grush from last year. We're going to forget about him too. You don't know half the names I rattled off, but it's the same thing. If he's not lying, he's being lied to. Joe and I did a 2-hour rumble with some guys on this when that came out. The best response I got was this tweet. Why are the UFO leakers getting slots on TV talk shows, but Edward Snowden is hiding for his life? My friend Havoc wrote, real whistleblowers, or I quoted him, and then I added, real whistleblowers, journalists are exiled. They're not celebrated. These UFO guys are reading a government script, otherwise they're dead or on the run. That's my words. Free Assange. Free Snowden. Hashtag fake. I love her reply. No one. I'm just over here waiting for the government to hurry up and fake the alien invasion. And I believe that's what's going to happen. There's also the memory metal out there today. It's called nitinol. Oh, darn it. Hi. Forgot him. Hi, I'm from the CIA. You may remember us from such psyops as buy these $3,500 surveillance glasses from Google. Also, Putin man bad. Look, it's aliens. And we don't know where this inflation is coming from. That's those responses I got when you put this stuff online on X. They're savages. The memory metal out there called nitinol. It's also argued to have been developed in the immediate aftermath of the Roswell crash. That's a video. You'll have to go to alienstranger.com to see the two videos you missed here. Wikipedia. I got to skip ahead for the sake of time. It's one of, oh yeah, we're going 10 minutes. Nickel titanium, known as nitinol in some of our eyeglasses today, by the way. Nitinol alloys exhibit shape memory and superelasticity. Shape memory recovers to recurring the metal's original undeformed shape upon heating. Superelasticity, however, occurs at a narrow temperature range. No heating is necessary to cause the undeformed shape to recover. Salute, Mr. Marcel, Captain General. Wow, that describes what he says he found. So we ask exactly how long has this stuff been around? Good old Wikipedia. Nitinol, by that name, if you're researching it, was more or less discovered during research in 1962, but not developed that we know of until a decade later. But the history of memory metals, if you don't search under that name, in general memory metals dates back to the red highlighted text to 1932, according to the same Wikipedia page on nitinol. That page looks different, but the 1932 date still stands as long as I've been checking Wikipedia. I didn't this year, but since 2000, whenever I did this, 2010. The source says the properties were first observed in 38, but also says no serious researchers waited until the 60s, again, that we know of. How much of it is a stretch? Here we go. Memory metals, first discovered in the 30s, might be making it into experimental secret crafts of the late 40s. I'm stretching things here. In May 2009, UFO reporter Billy Cox posted an article revealing that the files relating to the history of memory metals development in the 40s are now missing from the surprise there. The files are on their development are missing from both the U.S. Air Force Base and the Battelle Institute, both of which Cox says should have them. And General Craigie, you might know his name from the Roswell. He had an office at Wright-Patterson, Dayton, Ohio in 47, where the Roswell debris finally wound up. He made a hurried flight to Roswell during the whole controversy. So I forwarded the article to Mike Heiser. He does some research, and he blogs. Billy Cox notes nitinol can be linked back to the Oak Ridge Laboratory, where the kids were, a place that plays a key role in Nick Redfern's book. Mike adds, perhaps Craigie went to Roswell because he knew of a highly classified project involving a craft, then employed the use of nitinol, a metal that had the properties described by Marcel. Craigie heard the reports, did the math, he knew the project had to be kept under wraps and attention diverted. 1946 document originated in Wrightfield, Ohio, detailed the use of this Horton technology. That's Mike's blog, my bad. Again, from Mike's website. So, is the reason that the Roswell crash was taken to Wrightfield in the first place because that's where the only Army top brass who knew the whole picture actually worked out of? Is it possible that General Craigie just wanted his nitinol back? We don't know how rare this is. Was the 47 debris taken to Wrightfield, Ohio because that's where some of the Nazi scientists were? As that author Christina Gibson detailed, it's actually starting to sound like all of the above is why. The metal from the 47 incident was reported by Jesse Marcel Jr. to be unlike anything known at the time, which leads usually to this explanation, well then it must be from outer space. But that's perhaps a further leap in logic than is actually necessary at this point, knowing now that memory metals were first discovered in the 1930s. To finally really close it out, in 1947, of course the general public, 99% of the military, knew nothing about the exotic flying craft the Germans had invented or that the American government had in our possession and was working to replicate, to improve before the Russians could do it, come over here and wipe us off the map. And especially though, in 1947, American citizens, we would not have believed or even wanted to know that our government was even remotely capable of fatally experimenting on its own citizens for any reason. The possibility of just such well-documented now atrocities would not have even entered their minds. If I told them point blank to their face, they would call me a liar 70 years ago. Of course it wouldn't. We were the good guys, remember? If you did find out about this going on though, especially on accident, and you weren't supposed to know, might you be threatened with death if you spoke of them? You bet you would. Those were our top secrets at the time, and some of it was being done illegally behind the back of the President of the United States and without the consent or knowledge of Congress. So when the Roswell incident happened in '47, none of what we've shared today was even remotely within the realm of possibility to consider when faced with the facts that the 1947 witnesses reported. None of it. All people knew for 50 years was an exotic ship made of unheard of material, strange bodies crashed, and the government enforced a cover-up of never before heard of proportions. So to be fair, it took some pretty courageous people thinking really outside the box to even go on record considering that Roswell wreckage might be from another world. Just anybody willing to think outside the box for this event, even for the first 50, 60 years of the cover-up, has always done so, always at the risk of personal expense and extensive ridicule, especially from their peers and their family. The witnesses who have come forward over the decades, the researchers who have affiliated their good names with these stories are to be commended for their courage, I'll say, in many cases. But I do mean the legitimate, even the pro-alien researchers I've mentioned and many more whom I haven't mentioned. If I disagree with their conclusions based on information I've shared, doesn't mean I think they're evil or purposely scamming. All it means it's their view or my view or both. We're still wrong. But I'm suggesting that this proverbial box that people have been thinking outside of is today much larger than we previously thought. Do we have to go outside of this box to account for the reported details, eyewitness testimony of the Roswell incident anymore? You just consider if everything we've discussed today was public knowledge in '47 and the news got out, I think the conversation would go something like, oh, it's probably just another one of those stealthy Horton Lippish spinoff things they've been working on over at White Sands to fight the communists. Hope no one got hurt. What kind of legs do you think this story would have gotten over almost 80 years ago if the average American knew about Operation Paperclip or the fantastic Nazi flying machines? If we knew that in 1947, because the main strength behind the extraterrestrial hypothesis for the Roswell incident has, quite frankly, nothing resembling any proof of extraterrestrial activity, and it never has. The strongest and the only argument for the alien view has always been simply, well, I've never seen anything like that before. And there's just no other explanation for the reported facts. Other explanations. Will Smith meaning there. You really can believe most of the witnesses on this '47 incident, those that have stood the test of time, I want to say, and the scrutiny of researchers without thinking they're crazy, without thinking they're lying. You can believe them, but also without thinking aliens crashed here in 1947. Without some actual evidence or a stronger case for an alien explanation, I'm going to have to say that the people who do believe in the alien hypothesis have actually fallen for the government's con. That UFOs and aliens aren't being covered up. UFOs and aliens are the cover-up for what they're doing. Quoting Jack Brewer's famous book title, but in a completely different context, I'm stealing his phrase, the Greys were framed. There's two sides or more to every story. If you've ever only seen it from one side, the last point I have to make, I live here, and I'm asked, well, what are all the other Roswells that authors at the UFO Museum think of your talk? There's the truth that I was going to. There you go. For Mike Kaiser, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. That's my experience presenting this in Roswell. Nobody hates me. The only strategy or whatever, ignore me, and I'll sit here and continue to just do, with Joe's help and partnership, what we do.